From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Welcome to Psych, Health and Safety in Canada. And today I'm really thrilled to learn more from Sonia Funk, who's going to share lots of different tips and strategies that I bet many of you haven't heard of. And so I'm going to welcome Sonia and ask her to tell you a little bit about her journey to where she is today.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here today. And it's lovely to finally meet you besides just LinkedIn.
Yeah, isn't it funny how that's how we know most people now is through LinkedIn. And there's people that I message back and forth like dozens of times and then realize, oh, I don't actually know you. I haven't actually met you.
Yeah. And now that I have COVID memory damage, I'm like, have I met them in person? I don't even know. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of that in 2023. So that's going to be a lot of fun. But I will also answer your question here. I think it's kind of best to describe how I got here as, I can't obviously tell the whole story, but my life has really been like if Eat, Pray, Love and Forrest Gump movies had a baby, that would be my movie.
Oh my gosh.
I was kind of born, and when I was young, I kind of saw all of this. I just knew, and I just made a decision of the things that I was going to do. I didn't, had not factored in for the amount of hard things, pain and suffering that were going to be required to be the person who could do the things that I do now. Because it's your own personal journey to your own psychological safety. And then you have a resonance that can actually deliver that, right? In my language, which we'll learn to other people's nervous systems is probably how I would describe it. So it's been quite a journey. My first career was in music. Some people have probably heard my Christmas record in this country and they don't know it because they still play it. And so there's that whole story. I got to live all over the world. And when I ended up coming back to Canada, I had gone from music to a holistic nutrition diploma to living in some really big cities like New York and London, having great mentors and working in great integrated settings. And I just evolved this big picture perspective. And I think that happened because when I was 12, I heard Carolyn Miss on a set of cassette tapes, her thing called Why People Don't Heal. And she asked that question, does our biography become our biology? And I was 12 and these shivers went through my body and I'm like, oh, I'm going to spend my whole life answering that question. And I did. Music and the empathy and reading people and that whole industry. And then I also have vintage Earl's Girl status because that's how I supported my life when I was a musician. And then moving into the nutrition side of things, I ended up coming back to Manitoba and then back to actually where I was from in Morden, Manitoba, and doing a lot of work here. And I had a theory. And this is really where what I do now came from. I had a theory that proper strategic employee wellness or corporate wellness, whatever you want to call it, enough of that in enough companies in a geographical location could come together to form a strategy for community wellness as well, because the community members work for the companies. And this was a theory I had. So we tested that here. I grew a team. We did a lot of collaborative events with all forms of medicine and healthcare and perspectives in the same room, talking about their perspective on the same issue. And it was a lot of fun. And then I asked one of the companies here that I'd done a lot of work for, I asked their CEO, I said, I have a theory and I want to run it by you. Can I have half an hour of your time? And he said, sure. He knew me by now. I'd done quite a bit there. And so I sat down with him and I said, okay, here it is, because there's no BS with me. I'm very direct. I'm as nice as I can be when I do it. And I said, here's what I see. I said, I have this theory about this, employee wellness and community wellness. And these are all the things we've done. And I said, and here's what I see. I see the timelines, the stories and the lives of the people that work for you and the other companies, because some of his employees have become my clients. Happens when I talk in public, obviously. I said, I know how much they're ones that cost you the most. I know why they're costing you that much. And I know where the intervention is on those timelines to try to do something about that. I said, I also see that these same people and everyone are obviously going to a healthcare system that at this point, regardless of the who, what, where, when, how, we blame really doesn't help anyone right now. But at this point, our healthcare system is too overwhelmed and overburdened to really do much more than slap a pill or an intervention on it, push the compounding cost of the root cause down the road. People are also working longer than they used to because of all the things that have happened in the last couple of decades. So this aftermath, compounding cost of the root cause and all that comes with it is going to fall into the sphere of them working for you. So I also see at this point, I said, there's no one left in this country of ours to pay for this except for you, the business owner. And he just looked at me, he's like, oh, Sonia, you are worse than taxes.
Hey, you're just the messenger here. Wait a minute.
And I'm like, thank you. I take that as a compliment because I am also as unavoidable and as definite as taxes. Like it's going to happen. I said, but I have a strategy for this. And I have a theory. So he put his hands down on the arms of his chair. He's like, we need more time. And so they let me, him, and then he brought in a GM of an even bigger company. There's a lot of manufacturers here. And for the session for the day, so that I could practice my session for this that I had for leaders and decision makers, that is now called the biology of cost and ROI, which we discussed a little bit back and forth. And I practiced on the companies and leadership here in Southern Manitoba for that, because I have spent all of this time trying to understand all of the pieces of the puzzle that create the outcomes, because I see what we refer to as our mental health as an outcome of a lot of things. And the different pieces of the pie that contribute to that are different for everybody. So this one size fits all solutions that we have, the one pill culture that we seem to have evolved, isn't helping really anyone at this point, because there's so many reasons why. And then that automatically, I remember the first time I decided to go onto LinkedIn about a year and a half ago. I haven't been there very long. And I saw the psychological safety hashtag for the first time. And I was like, well, that's nothing but someone that has boundaries and self-worth and can create that for other people. Why do we need another hashtag for that? I was like annoyed. David McLean caught my annoyance on that. I think it was his post that I posted that on. And then he became my fan. And but obviously I'm like, okay, if that is what we need now to usher in all that is underneath that into the conversations and into the culture, I'm like, okay, I'll start hashtagging with that too. And let's start talking about those things. So, and here we are.
So I'll just tell you that there was an intention to use that language because we thought that people wouldn't know what it meant and they would have to rethink it, rather than assume workplace mental health was about people with mental illness. So it was intentional to use that phrase. But tell me what you taught at that very first session.
That very first session, it was a very unique opportunity, as my partially Forrest Gump life seems to continue to bring to me, where one of his employees, who was like one of his best employees, he said, if I had 500 of her, I'd have the best company in the world. And she had become my client. And then we had realized in our sessions that we probably would end up being friends. So I'm like, okay, we're not hanging out till I'm done my professional stuff. These are our boundaries. Then we can be friends when I send you off somewhere else. So we became friends too. So she allowed me to take her timeline and the medications that she was on in the benefit plan. By the time she came to me at about 42, she was on 4 or 5 medications. She was burning out. She was in an unhappy relationship, and all the things that contribute to all of the costs that are actually there, the things that create the outcome. And she allowed me to actually use her numbers and those costs along with her timeline. So in this, what I did, and her timeline is very, very typical. I will often use, I'll explain this in a second, what a 42-year-old woman's timeline, because it speaks to everyone, because they're either married to that person, or it's their sister, or it's them, or it was their mother. Everyone knows someone like this. So that timeline is key to all of the work that I do. And whether I'm speaking on mental health or the biology of safety or psychological safety or burnout, the timeline always comes in. Because if you can imagine the timeline of a 42-year-old woman that is on 4 or 5 medications and is unhappy and tired and wondering, WTF am I going to do with all of this stuff right now? I'm so tired. Usually, what you have is when they're born, like if I go this way, when they're born, there's some kind of microbiome injury, which all the microbiome research now is showing us how directly linked our microbiome function is to our mental health with the gut brain axis, the neurotransmitters that it produces and sends up to our brain and tells us how to feel.
Are you trying to tell me that our body and mind are one system?
Thank you. 10 points.
Yeah, it's funny that people don't get that, right? They think the mind must be hovering like 40 feet above them or something, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
all
And you know what? That's something that I'll use when I talk about mental health. I'm like, our mental health isn't this cloud around our head that we have no control over, that somehow putting a medication in here is going to solve all of its problems outside of here. It happens here. You don't have a feeling or an emotion or any of these experiences, positive or negative, without your body's full participation. Because you don't feel those things without chemicals that your body makes. So, yeah, so that's
okay.
what I'm telling
Sorry,
you.
so continue on your timeline. Yes.
So, microbiome injury, whether you were a C-section baby and then tragically also were not breastfed for whatever reason. I mean, they basically told moms not to at some point. This is nobody's fault. But the microbiome gets passed down from the mother through a natural birth and through breastfeeding. And if those things didn't happen, or it was a C-section and you were breastfed, probably okay. But if you had a lot of ear infections or, kidney infections, a lot of bronchitis or something like that, and you were on multiple courses of antibiotics when you were a kid, it damaged your microbiome. It takes a year or two for it to recover after one round of antibiotics, never mind 3 years in a row. And so that's going to alter your mood when you're older. And if it's really damaged or nothing was passed down and you inherited your parents' skin microbiome, you are set up for autoimmune conditions when you're older. And that's a very hard thing for some people to hear, because there was a lot of I always try to be nice about this, incomplete information several decades ago. And we went from, especially with kids and how to raise them and stuff like that, but it has done damage. So you have a microbiome injury, I call it. Usually in this end result that we're talking about right now, there is some kind of trauma that is not processed in the right window of time and gets stuck in the amygdala before the age of 8, whether it's mommy didn't come out of her room for 3 to 4 days, or someone was molested, or their stepdad started beating them. And there's some kind of trauma that wasn't resolved before the age of 8 or 9. And then that is stuck. Then you have the North American diet, which of course I have a whole session that I do on that kind of stuff too. That basically is setting your body up for failure, because you're not getting the building blocks that you need for the neurotransmitters and hormones that you need. If you're not eating the right foods, you're not getting the ammunition for your immune system. And your liver and eliminatory cleansing type organs that take care of stuff are overwhelmed. So puberty doesn't go well. And then we slap a pill on that for women, or for men, or boys, I should say, at that age. They are vulnerable to develop some kind of anger or rage complex if the surge of testosterone is not dealt with properly. And then they're shut up, and that's wrong. And then that causes problems later. With the women, we'll often slap a pill on it, which does impact psychological development as well. Then you get to university, and that's where the anxiety and depression really kind of hits. Each generation gets worse. We're talking about someone that's 42, 45 now. And you end up on medication. Your resonance and your trauma is likely going to attract an unhealthy partner to you. And then you're going to have to deal with that injury as well. You're going to be in an unhealthy relationship, or toxic, maybe abusive. 1 out of 4 is a really devastating stat. So the probability is high. Then let's say you have kids. Just like you weren't set up to properly process puberty, recovering from childbirth is really difficult. And women will go back to work or have the second one before they're even finished recovering. And so they never fully recover. Now you're getting into like your 30s and you're questioning things and you're tired and all this kind of stuff. Maybe you have a car accident or something happens, or there is a death in the family that you don't grieve properly. By the time you're 42, you're on anxiety and depression meds. You're on some kind of painkiller from that injury that didn't heal because your body doesn't have the capacity for it. And maybe at this point, because your HPA access is so worn out, your blood sugar regulation isn't good. Maybe you're even on metformin at this point for blood sugar. And then 42, which I'll draw the timeline out, or I have videos on it and stuff like that too. That's the big WTF question mark. And when you draw that out for a CEO in a boardroom full of decision makers, and if you can take, like I do, the average ages of males and females in a given department or location or whatever it is, and I can tell them what their benefit costs look like based on the ages and males and females in that department without looking at it, then I am worse than taxes, because I'm like, here's what happens the next 10 years. And we worked through all of that. And I showed them the interventions and what we did with this particular person. And she was off all of her meds within a year. And I said, this isn't going to be everybody. This was how much she paid to get off her meds. And you paid for some of it for different things and counseling. And I said, so this isn't everybody, but what if this was even 20% of your workforce? And what if you had a strategy in place to change the language around these things and give people other options? And then, like, I just like ask a better question.
Yeah. Okay. So now you've made life seem very hopeless and miserable. So tell us, if
Sorry.
we've got 42-year-olds sitting listening going, oh yeah, that that and
That's
all
me.
more
Yeah.
has happened to me. Give us some of the good news now, Sonia.
Okay. I can do that too. I don't walk in and depress everyone without like lifting you out of this terrible situation we're in.
Good.
I also can be better than taxes. I'm like a really savvy life tax accountant.
All right, let's hear
Okay.
it.
So if let's just say that we're like in a boardroom and we've said all of these things, or I'm in a one-to-one session. There is a lot to be said for simply changing the question and the language, like in a corporate culture. Some of the things, this is not my original question. This is every trauma-informed expert's question ever. Of the first thing to do when you look at your people, when I do some of the leadership stuff, or as an individual, when you look in the mirror, your question is not what is wrong with them. And your question for you is not what is wrong with me when you look in the mirror and you have a bad day or you just yelled at your kid. The question is what has happened to them. Because I just told you what has happened to them. There's different versions of that story, obviously. But if someone is struggling at that point, by the time they hit 40, some things have happened. And I think why psychological safety, and I'm so glad that you did pick a term that everyone was like, what's that? Because that is a very good strategy. And I am a strategist. So I do actually really like that. I just thought it was funny that I was annoyed at first because I'm a human. Then the universe is like, oh yeah, don't be such a jerk. Anyway, then I think what's really gonna matter with this whole psychological safety, everyone trying to figure it out right now, is to change some of those questions. And starting with some of the mental health stuff, I think helps the most, because it's probably the biggest barrier when it comes to the stigma and things that people don't want to talk about. And so one of the questions that I bring in when I do this stuff is I kind of expand on what has happened to me with, is it really an illness? And stay with me on this because the first set of questions might offend some people, but I'm going to qualify it. Is it really an illness or is it an injury? Or if it really is an illness, because obviously these things are very real, what injuries occurred to lead up to that? Because you cannot get something from nothing. You don't just wake up at 45 depressed and anxious. It was a process that got you there. And understanding how disease develops, which is a culture shift that really needs to be part of the psychological safety strategy, really is to change the perception of how these things evolve it's a process for years to get to the actual disease. It doesn't just all of a sudden appear unless there is like a massive trauma, which I have seen before. And then, like, I had a client who was sexually assaulted. Bam, she had an eating disorder, right? That was a very obvious cause and effect. She worked with me and a counselor at the same time to resolve those things, and she ended up fine. I got the nicest letter from her one day. But for the most part, it's like, what are the injuries that has happened to lead up to this imbalance where there's such an imbalance that it is now a disease? And then if there's starting to be signs of some of these things, then what are the injuries and which ones of them can I heal to change the trajectory of where this progression would go to disease? So understanding the difference between those two things, but also that there is, it's on a continuum, like everything else, empowers, especially the younger generation, to hijack those injuries and heal them before the disease progresses. And in when people are older and it has manifested in disease, how many of those injuries can you go back and heal to change the severity of this outcome in your life? And then the work that you do and the work that I do to shift the language of those things gives people different questions for themselves to answer and an understanding of how to advocate for themselves.
So
And
it's funny because I see the book, When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor
oh,
Mate
yeah.
behind you, but I'm reading The Myth of Normal
Oh,
right
me
now.
too.
And it's so aligned with everything that you're saying. But I do know that for some people, it is a difficult concept because they would never have wished illness on themselves. They had never have welcomed it. And there is the misperception in what you're talking about that it's their fault. And I know that's not the intention at all, that it is what happens to us, not who we are, that puts us in that place. But so we've got people listening right now, I have no doubt, who are saying, okay, so now what do I do?
Uh-huh. So when I'm actually talking to an individual again or a leadership team with these things, I mean, there's a reason that my mental health keynote is called "It's Not Your Fault." And I talk about 7 different kinds of injuries throughout our life. What I generally have people do is to start, because this is a big perception shift. Perception shifts require energy and contemplation and pondering and all those kinds of things. So I just say, just go home for a week and just change this one question. The next time you want to ask what's wrong with my kids or people that I work for or myself or that kind, start asking, no, I'm not going to do that, even just for a week, even if it's hard. I'm going to say, what has happened to them? Because the answer will be very, very different. And for personal lives, where what usually happens in my office with individuals is tears. There's always a Kleenex box here. I get a lot of, this is the first time my life has ever made sense to me. Because
Sorry, can you say that again? It was hard to hear.
They will often say, this is the first time my life or anything has ever made sense to me.
Yeah.
Because I walk them through their own timeline. So draw out your own timeline. You know all the things that happened from 1 to 7, 7 to 14, divided up into 7 years, and then go back and circle with like a heart red pen or marker all the injuries. It's a bit of a ritual of marking the places and things that we still need to grieve. And what I find is I am still a guide, obviously, with the one-to-ones, but once someone has seen their story on a piece of paper and they have changed the question of, this is what's happened to me, there was no other way that this was going to go. And, and especially when I do this in a group with women in particular, and other people are also, talking about their timelines. It's just like, when this happens, this is what happens. When this happens to you, this is what happens in your body. When this happens to you, this is where your brain shuts down. And that's why you didn't, leave or whatever it was. And then this happens. And then when you don't know what to do and you're in the stress response and the blood flow has been reduced to the front of your, to the front of your brain where you think rationally and process emotions and regulate yourself, then you're going to take the first answer that comes. And that particular answer or potentially intervention may have done more harm. And now here you are. And one of the most important things when you see that is you have to understand that in order to have the tenacity and the drive to do something about the injuries, you have to grieve them. And
How
that
do they define an injury versus, hey, that's just life?
no such thing as that's just life, if you don't mind me saying so.
No. So what would you qualify as an injury that might have the kind of impact that you're talking about?
So I would go in the first 7 years, you're looking for childhood infections, hospital stays, traumas, whatever it was, even a move, even moving town and losing attachments and connections. Because there's, I think, I had heard the big T and little T thing before I read the myth of normal, but there are big T's and little T's, big traumas and little traumas. And I think what's important to understand when you're looking at these things is this size or severity of the trauma or the injury that happened is kind of irrelevant if it happened to you in a time and space where you did not have the support that you needed to process it. If you don't have someone there for you to help you process something that happened in a specific window of time, it gets relegated to the survival brain as a memory to overprotect you and make you overreact for the rest of your life until you move that trauma out.
Mhm.
So, understanding anything, especially in those first 8 years, if your mom had a trauma when she was pregnant with you, epigenetics and all those things are proving that that gets passed down and that gets lodged in your nervous system as well. Because kids depend on the mother's and the parents' nervous systems to co regulate for a very long time. So, anything, whether it was neglect, uh, an unavailable parent that loved you but wasn't there, when you needed them, something's serious like molestation, physical abuse, losing a grandparent that you were very attached to and you just really weren't able to express it. Anything that impacted you in that way and hasn't, if you still think of it and if you were to tell the story about it to someone and it still triggers sensations in your body and there's a visceral effect to it, that might be something that you might want to not have stuck in your nervous system and your primitive brain anymore so that you don't react that way. So those are those young injuries.
That is such a great way to describe it, that if you're having a physical reaction to a memory, that it's stuck. And
Yeah.
and those ones are, or if of course there's some that you just don't want to think about at all, but the reason you don't want to think about them is because of the physical impact
Yes.
that it has on you.
Yeah.
One of the things that you said that really had a big impact on me was, the idea of asking what happened to people. It shifts so much away from judging people, but more importantly, I think, from reacting. That if you are sharp with me or say something that I feel is hurtful, if I take it personally, we could end up with some big relationship issue. But if I go, "Ooh, that's not the way Sonia usually is. I wonder what's happening for her today," then I can get past it. I don't take it personally and we can move on. In the workplace, this could revolutionize some toxic teams and toxic relationships. Can you speak a bit about what you teach in that area?
I do have a team building workshop. It's focused on boundaries, which is the stuff that you're talking about right now. I just call it humans in the office because I just couldn't think of a better title for it. And what I do in my work, because of the journey that I've had, like I even ended up with a music prof when I was still in university before I quit university and toured with my band. That she was doing her PhD in FM synthesis. She explained body resonance to us in the early or late 90s using frequency and music to explain why you can walk into a room and not like someone right away because of the resonance of their nervous system that you're picking up. And then so I took some of that a step further because I'm like, you're all just a bunch of nervous systems walking around and you co-regulate each other to an extent. And this is what you're actually dealing with. And some nervous systems are more easily triggered than others. Because if you have a guitar on one side of the room and the other side of the room, and you pluck the E string on this one, that frequency vibration, just like in the orchestra that you can feel when you're there, travels across the room. And when it hits that same string on the other guitar, it makes it vibrate. And there is a lot to be said about how our physiologies interact with each other that way. So I kind of come in and go, nervous system, does that scare you? We're going to talk about it today because everyone has told me, like, you can't talk about nervous system in corporate work. And I'm like, oh no, corporate world will not survive if we don't start talking about the nervous system. So boo, here I am. And so we do some boundary exercises and we talk about a few things on that level. And there's kind of two parts to it. There's understanding exactly what you just said and being able to go, okay, that's probably not me. I don't want to, take that personally or what has happened with them, to approach that person in an empathetic way. And then on the other hand, then there's also wherever your self-worth and your boundaries are at will determine how much of it still actually affects you, even though you have that question. That question is a good buffer and some little bit of appropriate armor to not take stuff on. If you can do that and it helps, but you still carry it with you, then there's still some boundary self-worth work to do here. And I mean, and that is really what's at the heart of that last question too, on if you have these injuries, what do? You explore some options and figure out how to understand your story about yourself in a compassionate way and figure out where you can pull yourself back from those injuries and things that happen, to have all or more of you at the very least back here, so that you actually have that self-worth back to say, okay, that happened. It shouldn't have happened. It impacted me. I have dealt with it the best I can. Now I can take some ownership because the things that were not my fault, I've done my best with. And then you can also get to a point where you can do exactly what you just said. And it's like, oh man, I wonder what happened to them, and have that empathy. And then just go, yeah, and that's definitely not mine to carry. And then literally walk away from it and not take it with you in your nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long answer for that.
That actual skill is so difficult for some people. But I can say that once you pick it up, your whole life opens up. It's lighter, it's brighter, it's easier. As somebody who used to ruminate about everything, but what if I said the wrong thing? What if you were upset with me? What if you thought this or thought that? And I could go for weeks worrying about these things. And as you say, you start to link it back to, when did you first worry about the way people might react to you? When did you first worry that they would reject you or abandon you or whatever? And when you can let go of it, oh my goodness, life is so much easier.
Yeah. And that is where the hope is also, like for companies, for leadership teams, and trying to sort some of this out, where some of the hope is. And because I probably do have more hope than we'll even get into today. You don't need everyone to shift. You only need about 10 to 15% of people to get some of this and start doing some of the work to change the literal vibe from the nervous systems in that office. You just need a few people to start resonating on a less stressed, more confident, kinder level. Because then what that does is they actually will help. It's okay if I keep using the word nervous system. This isn't too out there. When you have a few nervous systems that are functioning better, emitting a better frequency, they literally, like when you're tuning a guitar to the string, they'll start to pull other people into a place that feels more psychologically safe, that need a little bit more support to actually be able to start doing some of the work that way. So you don't have to get everyone. So it's not as impossible as it seems. You just need to get a few key people, really. And then I was going to say something else there with that. What was it that you just said? I felt like it was important.
Just saying about, how much lighter your life is when you can let go of it. But I was also thinking, Sonia, that you were talking about going into organizations and that only 10% of the people have to change, and about the central nervous system in the 90s, you would have been woo woo, right? That's what we would
Oh
have said.
yeah.
You're woo woo, you're way out there, but so much of science has caught up with you.
Yeah.
And so much of science now says, yes, we all are energy. We all emit energy. We all read the energy of other people. This is now science instead of woo-woo. But I'm surprised you had a professor in the 90s talking in that way.
Yeah. But it was like, it was under the camouflage of music theory. Right.
Yes.
And frequency. So, and it was a religious college too. The music department was there. And then I was doing the biology at the U of W. So that's the story of my life. I ended up in those situations all the time where I learned some stuff. But I think what is, do you want to hear a story actually about what you
I'd
just
love to hear a story.
Okay. So when I came back here, Southern Manitoba is known to be a very religious area. There are so many Mennonites here. I am a Mennonite. This is, not shocking. I'm from here. And when I came back and I was building my business here and doing the events that I was talking about and had the theory that I was trying to explore, I met with some physiotherapists here that own a few clinics. And it was two guys. And I just told them a little bit about my journey. And I said I kind of explored everything, the totally concrete, like hard evidence-based stuff and some of the woo-woo stuff. And because I wanted to understand it all, because I saw where neuroscience was going. I saw where psychoneuroimmunology was going, where epigenetics was going. And I'm like, this stuff is not going to be weird much longer. If I was ever going to do a podcast, I would have called it unweirding 10 years ago or something like that. and one of the guys said, he's like, I'm good with if something's working for someone, I don't have to, believe in it if it's working. He's like, that's great. He's like, but I like that. He's a physiotherapist. Like he likes the hard evidence stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, that's totally fair. But I said, dudes, I'm like, we all grew up here, right? They said, yeah. I'm like, 20 years ago, the acupuncture that you do in your clinic was from the devil, remember? And they were like, you have a point. So I think now is a really kind of scary world event time to be alive, but also a very fun, exciting, hopeful time to be alive, because all the answers for all this stuff that we're dealing with, we have them already. We just need people, like you and I and all the amazing people out there like Brene Brown and Adam Grant that are writing all the books to pull it together in a way that our overwhelmed brains can grasp it.
Well, and to say it in a way that people who are not where you're at right now can hear it. So sometimes it's baby steps, and sometimes it's just little things that they open up their minds and open up their approaches to it. So when you're talking to a CEO who is old school and closed-minded, how do you try to shift them?
So that kind of being from a religious area here, that was why I practiced here. To learn how to speak to everyone. And I don't even mean that in an insulting way, right? My job in what I do, more so than anything else that I've learned, if the universe or whatever you believe in for destiny or whatever it is, what my task was in this life was to learn how to do enough work with my ego or my need to be right, or all these kinds of things that we do to protect ourselves, to do enough work there so that I could ask a question without a motive, and so that I could find the way to ask the question in the language that the person I'm speaking to will understand, because my responsibility wasn't to make them see it my way. My responsibility was to be able to convey what I know in a way that will actually engage them and possibly give them a new question to shift a perspective. It's a more subjective, I guess, way of doing things. And I think if you had a really close look at my books, I've had in the world as many spiritual teachers as I have biology. And I have looked at all of the spiritual traditions and the wisdom that we kind of threw out a while back. And I wanted to know them all because I could see that science was starting to back a lot of that wisdom up. And so when science would have a thing or say a thing, I'm like, oh yeah, that's from 5,000 years ago. That's from 2,000 years ago. That's from, 1,500 years ago. Like that makes sense to me because I learned it that way while also studying the biology. And so how to talk about the nervous system without scaring people. So I just go in and say, I'm going to scare you with the nervous system, but it won't be so bad. Like just call it what it is. And I think to have that approach, because the part that I didn't tell in that story about the CEO that thought I was worse than taxes was that I also said to him, he was like, whoa. And I'm like, okay, but I do have a plan. And I said, what I actually need to know is what is actually important to you right now, despite all the bad news. What do you think you need right now with all this going on? And what is actually even fair to ask you to do? Just because it's falling on your lap doesn't mean you have to do it. And so I feel like it's the language, but also coming from a very authentic place of with leaders. I'm just kind of like, well, it wasn't in your job description 20 years ago that you were supposed to solve the complexity of the human race. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah,
I'm
sorry about your luck.
and come at it with empathy because they'll get criticized. Oh, they don't care. And it's just company and it's numbers. And I'm like, well, that's been their job for a very, very long time. And now suddenly everyone's saying they're also now tasked with solving the complexity of the human race. And I'm just like, give them a break.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think that's just me as a person that's figured out how to do that and have that language and read the room and go like, I know I'm going to say some stuff that you're not going to like, and maybe you'll disagree and that's okay. There's a few things I know for sure. And if they can help you in your goals and with whatever strategy you have, and I can help make that strategy better for you, even if you don't buy into all the Sonia stuff or whatever it is, then let's just start there. I don't need anyone to agree with me or like me. I just want to be able to say things in a way that the most people possible could hear and find themselves a better question. That's my job.
Yeah. Well, and that's an amazing thing. If you can accomplish it with at least 10% of the people you speak to,
Yeah. Right.
you're slowly changing the world. What about the leader who says, yes, I buy into what you're saying. I think it's important, but my staff aren't ready to make changes. How can I be a better leader right now?
With the leadership coaching, it does come back to some of the stuff, obviously, that I've covered already. I will work with them and their health and their perspective of their people, how they see themselves, how they manage their life, how they feel about their family and their personal relationships. Because if you start there, and I'm not saying that all leaders need all of this, but there's usually, we all have room for improvement on a lot of things. When you start to show up to work, to lead in a different frame of mind or a different frame of nervous system, if you will, and if you have practiced different questions, you will start creating psychological safety without anyone knowing that that's what you're doing, but they will feel it. That I promise. They will feel it. And if they feel a little bit safer, even if you weren't obviously trying to make it not safe before, but they will feel it will feel different because when you ask that question, what has happened to them? Instead, you create what we know in our bodies is already is curiosity. And curiosity in conversations and interactions is what is like the fertilizer for psychological safety. So one of the tools that I will give leaders, which I use in a few of my different topics that I speak on as well, is I love from this book here, the 3 universal triggers of stress. is one of the best tools that I give anytime I talk about mental health or psychological safety, because the three universal triggers of stress are uncertainty, lack of information, and loss of control. There is nothing that has ever stressed you out that one, two, or all three of those were not involved. When you are looking out at someone that's freaking out or having a breakdown, across your desk from you, or your 3-year-old, doesn't matter. Those three universal triggers of stress are at play. So in the team building exercise, one of the things I'll do is I will give them a different question with that, not because I actually think that people are going to say this question exactly this way, but you start rehearsing it in your head. When someone's sitting across from you, you're a leader and they've clearly got stuff going on. Maybe they're holding back tears. Maybe they did actually, break down, or there's been a lot of mistakes or whatever it is. If you find your own way to say, or if everyone has done a workshop with me, then you can actually use it. And it's kind of funny. You can say, which of the three universal triggers of stress can I help you with right now? Because that takes everyone out of the narrative. That bypasses the triggers because no one's ever asked you the question before. And what it does is it allows people to step back and be the witness instead of involved in the story and the ego and all of that here, and say, we all encounter all three of these all the time. These are the things that are actually producing this visceral emotional reaction in this person. And if you say, which of these three things can I help you with? You're not blaming them. You're not making them feel like it's their fault. You're just like, we all struggle with these things. And that creates the curiosity. So bam, instant psychological safety in that office for sure. And you might actually find the conversation will go differently than it ever would if you hadn't asked that question. And you'll find solutions that you just wouldn't even have known were there, because you don't necessarily have to give them those three things back in the situation if it can't change right now. Maybe there's somewhere that you can give them some control, which moves us further back into the parasympathetic system instead of the sympathetic, which is where the stress response happens. Maybe there is some certainty at work that you can give them that will make them feel better about the uncertainty that they have at home. Maybe there is some information that they're actually missing, or you can point them in the right direction to go and get, even if it isn't about what they're actually freaking out about, because it doesn't actually matter. When you quell some of those things, the person shifts further out of the stress response, more into the resting response. The blood flow returns to the rational part of their brain and to yours, because then you're not feeling stressed out with them too. And a different question emerges. It's magic.
And we can all use a little more magic in our lives, but I love that. I actually, I know that any stress response is probably rooted in fear, and all three of those are creating fear, right? Uncertainty and lack of control. But you mentioned something earlier that I want to ask you about for very personal reasons, that I'm working on issues related to suicide. And you mentioned about hope. And that is one of the things that is missing when someone will choose suicide. How do you help give hope?
I just heard recently, I was keynoting a conference in Edmonton in September. They had a woman, Rana Javen. I think I'm saying that right. She was one of the first people in the world to research hope. And she's the reason that the Hope Studies Institute at the University of Alberta exists. The stuff that she said about hope blew my mind. She said, and I didn't know this, she said that with the studies that they had done and that have been done since, loss of hope is responsible for way more suicides than depression is. Because apparently those two things are actually different, but are probably not mutually exclusive, obviously. And she said, hope can be taught. I was like, really? It's a skill, apparently. So this is literally something that I have on my list to learn, how to teach this skill. I'm like, this is a skill. This is amazing. This is coming into my corporate work. But I think how I have done it, whether it was deliberate or not deliberate, because I know that hope, it really is a big deal. And as long as people have hope, then their body chemistry will stay in a place where they probably will not take their life, right? I did that by lifting the blame and the apathy of what had happened. When you change that word that we've already talked about here to what has happened to me, and you look at the things that have happened as injuries instead of just this illness that only has certain things you can do for it, and then you're just stuck with it, or who knows, if you can look back and go, well, of all these 7 things on my timeline that led up to this, there's like 3 of them that I could actually go back and try to heal, which could change the outcome I have right now. That's hope. Do you want to ask something more specific?
Yeah, no, that's great. Just to be able to
Yeah.
see a way out, that I don't have to stay stuck where I am, right? And if you said if you have 7 things that happened and you can heal 3, what kinds of things can be healed and which kinds of things cannot be?
Well, I think a lot of people who've been doing what I do for a long time is like, I don't know if there's actually anything that for sure can't be healed. I don't know. I mean, I have maybe kidneys when they're done, right? Like on a physiological level. I have had clients actually improve kidney function when been kicked out of high risk kidney clinics as a medical miracle. We didn't solve all of their problems, but I think that you should start from the place of maybe all of them can be. These 3 look the easiest. Anything that is trauma related, with the new trauma therapies that are out there, with the new research, which is probably a little bit taboo right now still, but that's happening over in BC. I'm like, yes. um, there, it's yeah. I think I would say start from the premise of who knows, maybe all of them can be healed. Anything trauma related, where it comes to psychological stuff, can be healed to an extent, and who knows, maybe all the way. It's not like you ever forget the things that happened to you, but I do love how Gabor Mate explains that, where he says trauma isn't what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside of you. And that's really the good, hopeful news, because if it's something that happened inside of you, you have control over it to heal it. If it was just something that happened to you and you can't do anything about that, that was out of your control, right? So understand that it happened, what has happened inside of you and where you live and where there's visceral reactions and or nightmares or emotional dysregulation and those kinds of things. If it's here, you can do something about it for sure. The physical stuff that moves into the nutritional therapy, side of stuff, which
Well,
would be
and we are fast approaching being at a time, but I can't let you go without asking you just to share a little bit. I mean, the person who wrote Food Mood, you need to tell us something that you know about food and nutrition.
oh, sure. Okay, I can for sure. I can talk about it. Can't do a nutritional therapy session, but I can say that when it comes to food, and then I do in my practice use some supplements as a therapeutic use to help specific systems kind of heal a little bit faster, because sometimes we're so depleted that we do need extra. My big thing with food, because I always have like a big thing with everything, right? Mental health is it an illness or is it an injury or it's both? And with psychological safety, I'm like, you ask a different question and create curiosity, you're like halfway there. With food, the hashtag that I owned for the longest time on Instagram was there's no such thing as healthy food. Something is either food and it gives your body what it needs to do what it knows how to do, or it is not food. It interferes with those functions, robs your body of the precious resources that it did have, and messes things up for you. And we don't need any more nutritional studies because your body tells you how it feels about what you eat every day. So that's my summing up on the food. What we all know by now is that where there are any physical ailments or diseases, inflammation plays a role in almost all of them. The best place that you have control over doing something about that is with food. To take the foods out that are inflammatory, which are all the foods that have been labeled as bad. Oh, sorry, my bell went off there. It's all the foods that have been labeled as bad. We know that, but I think that can be really hard. There's a reason why diets haven't worked and why all of the crazy fad diets and supplements and the best next thing and the next superfood and stuff like that hasn't actually solved any problems. In case anyone hasn't noticed, none of that has solved our problems. Maybe we need to ask a different question about this. Is that something is either food? When you go into the grocery store, just ask the question, is this actually food? Does this have what my body actually needs? Or is it not food and it is actually going to hurt me more than it's going to do anything else? And that doesn't mean that question changes overnight, because there's all kinds of physiological drivers and motivations in our body that have to become unaddicted to stuff like sugar and those kinds of things. Not I still have some sugar, but not that it's an absolute. And we also have this survival brain of ours that is a little bit outdated that will override willpower. Willpower is not a thing unless you are a whole, balanced, non-sick, non-traumatized person. You don't have access to the power of willpower most of the time. So it's not your fault if you can't stop yourself from eating that thing. To start very slowly with the question, is this food and will this help me, or is it not food and will it not help me? And promise yourself, commit to yourself not to judge yourself for choosing the non-food because you've been conditioned to want it and that's not your fault. You will slowly start sometimes choosing the food, because then what you're also doing is you're choosing yourself. Food mirrors our relationship with ourselves, but it does also mirror some physiological things from having the North American diet in our lives for so long that our willpower can't even override. So if you come at it from a compassionate place and also going, okay, I'm going to start asking this question, and slowly but surely, I'm going to start choosing real food more and more often, the inflammation in your body will go down. The symptoms and discomforts that you have, while I can't guarantee that you'll heal, whatever it is that's going on, will come down, because the non-foods create inflammation and they make all of your pain worse.
Mhm.
And if that maybe that's the question, will this give me more pain or less pain tomorrow? Right? Because people think they eat something. Oh, it doesn't bother me. There's someone that I love very dearly, and this will kind of have some people go, oh. But he's like, I got a stomach of steel. I can take anything, said the guy on cholesterol and blood pressure meds. OMG, just got to keep my mouth shut.
Yeah, sometimes we do just have to, because I know we're at a time. I think I could talk to you for another hour or so, but can you just answer the question that I ask all the guests, which is, if somebody said to you, what is a psychologically healthy and safe workplace? And they want to know, what does it feel like to be in one? What would your answer be?
I have worked in a psychologically safe environment at one point, maybe two points actually. They were both restaurants, which is very rare because I worked in a lot of them. Walking into a psychologically safe workplace probably begins when you wake up in the morning, actually. If you don't have a sense of dread or anxiety about that day, that'd be like sign number one. When you physically walk in, or I guess walk into a Zoom room meeting, or you physically walk into the office, if you don't have a feeling here in your solar plexus about going in, or any kind of sense of dread, and your stress response is not quietly firing in a low grade chronic way that's destroying your health because of your job, then you probably have a psychologically safe workplace. And if something's going on, I would say if you can go to your boss or the leader and be able to say, because if you have a psychologically safe workplace, you have a different language. You just do, right? So if you have the language that has probably maybe been taught to you through the workplace or wherever else, to go in and say, there's some stuff going on. It has kind of become chronic. It's impacting my health. or this thing is going on, or I cannot focus because my rational brain is offline because I cannot get the flow back to the rational part of my brain. I think I would actually serve the team or the group better if I wasn't here for a couple days and have a leader that understands that language. The implications of that conversation being able to happen in a company are like probably sevenfold, because you have someone who is less likely to be on anxiety meds 3 months later, so you're not paying for that. You have someone who, if that is supported in the workplace, they will be able to ask for it in their personal lives. So maybe they won't even get divorced or go on stress leave when they're miserable, and they won't make that mistake that will cost you that much money. That's how I can't help it. That's from the biology of cost and ROI perspective. That's how I see it.
Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you for everything that you shared today. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you, if they wanted your services, wanted you to come and speak, how would they get in touch with you?
The easiest is just go to my website, thewholeavocado.com. Some of my gateway programs are right there. There's a book a call. And I just tell people, look, chats with me are fun. If you don't end up hiring me, it's okay. Book the call. We have a chat and see if it's a fit. And because I don't suit every organization, and that's okay.
Some might not be ready for you, but those who are will do well. So yeah. Thank you so much. And just to say to the listeners to subscribe, and thanks to Flourish DX for supporting this opportunity for me to learn from Sonia, and have a great day.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.